Welcome back to Old Testament Survey. This has been a strange season for us here in the United States, and it's been strange for us at Friends. And I'm sorry that you guys are having to go through this really strange semester. And I'm sorry that our class has had to move from a live in class, in the classroom class, to an online class. But hopefully, we'll be able to finish out this semester successfully and also being able to learn a little bit. Let me go over a few things that have changed in relationship to the Old Testament survey course that you've been enrolled in. Now, you'll probably be able to discern all this information that I'm going to share with you just by looking at Moodle. But let me go over it just to clarify any confusion. First off, there's 5 things that you need to keep in mind as we proceed through the class. First one, five components of the class. Let me put it that way. The first component is a weekly lecture that I'm going to provide you over Moodle. Now, this lecture is not something you have to tune in for at a specific time. It'll be available to you first thing on Monday mornings. You can view it, and it'll outline for you what's going on in the coming week. In this lecture, I'll cover just the material that we're looking at. It's going to be a brief lecture, nowhere near as long as the lectures that we had in class. And many of you are going, thank God, those were incredibly difficult. But it'll be about 10 to 15 minutes at the most. And it'll cover a few of the details that you need to keep in mind for the class coming up that week. So the first thing is the professor's lecture. The second thing that you need to keep in mind are the readings. And you have to do the readings in order to do well in this class. You need to engage the material that we're discussing here in the Old Testament. And those readings are highlighted for you every week. So just pay attention to those. And if you have any questions, contact me and we'll make sure that we get them straightened out. Number 3, the third thing that you need to pay attention to are the Bible Project videos that are going to show up each week. Now, these videos are about 5 to 7 to 8 minutes long. They're all animated. They're all really interesting. They tell the story of what we're trying to understand a lot better than I can. So I encourage you to view those videos. And then the fourth thing, I can't do my third finger very well. So the fourth thing that you got to do is write some summaries based upon those videos. I want you to view all the videos, but you only have to do summaries on the ones that I assign. So pay attention to Moodle. It'll be very obvious what you need to do. The summaries are very simple. Basically, what you need to do in the summary is that you need to summarize in 3 to 7 sentences, one paragraph, what the main points of the video. And then I want you to commit one sentence to telling me what you appreciated about the video yourself. And then number 5, fifth thing that you need to keep in mind, we're going to have 2 more exams in the class. And these exams are going to be fairly easy. They're going to be multiple choice. They'll be online. They'll be time limited. They'll be open note, open book, open internet, open friend, open whatever. Now, again, they're going to be time limited, so if you don't know the material, it's going to be difficult for you to do well on them. But those are the 5 things: the lecture, the readings, the Bible Project video, the summaries, and then the exams. Okay, and all this you'll see online. And one last thing for you to keep in mind: I do have extra credit available to you. So one thing that I've done is initially you were supposed to complete 2 projects in this class. So far you've done 1. I'm dropping the second project. You don't have to do it. However, if you want to do it for extra credit, you may give it a shot and it'll be worth 40 points. Also, there's the interpretive grid exercise that I talked to you about before spring break. That is available to you to do as well. If you want to do extra credit, contact me via email and we'll discuss it and we'll decide what kind of extra credit you're going to attempt to accomplish. Keep this in mind. Each assignment is worth 40 points. You can do 2 of them if you wish for a total of 80 points. That'll help your final grade. Now, keep in mind, just because you're doing the assignment doesn't mean you're going to get all 40 points. You still have to do a good job on the assignment. I'm going to grade it accordingly. But there is up to 40 points per assignment, 80 points total available to you if you want to do that to help get your grades up towards the end of the course. Some of you need it, others of you are doing pretty well. And one thing I'll mention, the summaries that you have to create for the class, these are actually serving to replace the quiz grades, the weekly quiz grades that we're doing, that we were doing prior to spring break. Now, unlike the quiz grades, you have to complete each one of these final summaries. There's 7 of them. You have to do all of them in order to get the credit that you need to finish the course. Okay. Let's shift gears and let's talk about this first week that's coming up and talk about the content, the material that you're going to be exploring in the class. I'm going to move my screen so I can see what I'm looking at here straight from Moodle. Now, for this first week, we're going to be covering 2 different eras or 2 connected eras in the life of the people of Israel. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is that the end of the Exodus story. We're going to look at the death of Moses and Joshua, the new man in charge of Israel. And then we're going to be looking at the books of Joshua and Judges, which tell the story in different ways of the conquest of the Promised Land. The book of Joshua tells a pretty positive point of view, and the book of Judges gives it from a very negative point of view, negative view of the conquest. I want you to keep in mind, we've discussed this before, but there are 2 defining moments in the life of the people of Israel that talk about and describe their coming together as a nation. The first one of these is the Exodus. It's during the Exodus that the people of Israel become an actual nation. They become a country or a people. They're no longer just a clan or a tribe or a family. They're a nation of people. So that happens during the Exodus, and remember Exodus 19:6, where God promises them if they keep his covenant, they will be for him a holy nation, a nation of priests, a kingdom of priests. So the Exodus is where they become a nation. Then there's this event that we're going to study towards the end of the semester called the exile, when Israel, after they end up in Jerusalem and in the Promised Land, they're taken away from the Promised Land into exile. And exile is a very important time to understand Israel as well. So there's Exodus, where Israel is created as a nation, and then there's the exile, which is where Israel is their sense of national identity is challenged because they are removed from the land, and all of their nationality and religious identity is taken from them. As I said, we're going to talk about that later. But what we're going to be looking at this week and next week is the important material between these 2 big events. So back to the story of the Exodus, or at least the end of the Exodus, and the death of Moses. One thing that we're adding to this that you're going to be looking at comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. There's also a video that covers this. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we are introduced to this concept of the Shema. Shema is the Hebrew word that means listen or hear. And let me read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am reciting you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Now that is the Shema, and it doesn't really sound like a prayer like what we would pray today. But I want you to keep in mind that every day of Jesus' life as a good, faithful Hebrew man, a Jewish man, he would begin the day by reciting the Shema. And he would say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is God alone," or "the Lord is one God." And when he would do this, this was his way of committing himself faithfully to the Lord in every day. And the Shema is the root of prayer for Christian prayer that comes along later on. So the Shema, again, means listen, and it's translated in our NRSV Bibles on page 262, by the way, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." And he's the only one that they are to worship. So that's the Shema, and I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts as you look at as you view the videos on the Shema that are in the Bible Project. Also, at the end of Deuteronomy, and we've mentioned this in class briefly already, we see the story of Moses' death. He's looking into the promised land, but he cannot go in. And he dies even though he's still full of life. So the 120 years of Moses' life come to a conclusion there on the top of Mount Nebo as he's looking into the promised land. Now, after he does this, this leads us into the book of Joshua, which tells about the story of the invasion and the conquering of the promised land. And in this is the famous story of the Battle of Jericho. Now, in Joshua chapter 1, Joshua's role as the leader of the people of Israel is re-examined, not re-examined, but reaffirmed, I should say, starting in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, when these words are repeated. He says, "The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And that sounds a little bit like what it says in Exodus 19:6. And it is a reminder to the people of Israel that they are to follow the laws, the 10 commandments that we've read about in class, and all the 614 laws that are contained in the book of Leviticus. And this is how the conquest story begins. I do want to read one other quick part of this to you, just so you can keep in mind a little bit of what's happening. Just before they conquer the city of Jericho, Joshua, the leader of the people of Israel, is walking around the building, meditatively, perhaps even praying. And we read about this in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. Listen to these words. "Once, when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, 'Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?' The man replied, 'Neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come.' And Joshua fell on his face to earth and worshipped, and he said to him, 'What do you command your servant, my lord?' The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, 'Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy.' And Joshua did so." Now, one of the important things about this part of the story is that it reminds us that God's actions and God working through the people of Israel was not in exclusion to everybody else on the planet. As a matter of fact, when Joshua says, "Are you on our side or their side?" the man says, "I am on no one's side." This is evidently an angel that represents the power of God. And Joshua, when he asks what he is supposed to do, he's not told to fight. Instead, he's told to take off his shoes, because where he's standing is on holy ground. So that gives us a little bit of a picture of what it's like in Joshua. Now, there are some parts in the book of Joshua where the Israelites fail, and fail spectacularly. But for the most part, the book of Joshua tells a positive story about how the people of Israel move slowly into the land and conquer it. Now, let's talk about the book of Judges, because in the book of Judges, we see a different story. Now, let me begin by reading to you the very last verse of the book of Judges. This is in the book of Judges, chapter 21, verses 25, on page 396 in your books. The concluding line says this: "In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." Now, when you read the book of Joshua, and you're not assigned all of it to read, but I encourage you to read it all, you might think that it reads like a horrible comic book. You might think that it is some of the most vile, violent, and horrible literature that you've ever read in your life. And I think you'd be right. I wouldn't argue with you on that. But it's also a book that shows how the people of Israel would not keep faith with God as they were called to take over the promised land. And that's one of the most challenging parts of this book, is to interpret it well. It's filled with violence. It's filled with very descriptive acts of violence, even. If you read the story of Ehud in the chapters 1 and 2 of Joshua, you'll read a pretty gross kind of story about a left-handed man who conquers an evil king. You'll also come across the story of Deborah and Jael, which I'm going to discuss here in a moment. And then there's the story of Jephthah, which quite frankly is kind of a confusing story. Jephthah is a hero of the faith, but he's a hero who chooses to make a sacrifice that is unacceptable, unbelievable, inconceivable even. And we read about in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, about how he's a hero of the faith, and it just doesn't make sense. And then there's the end of the book where we read about the Levite and his concubine and the Benjamites. And if we were meeting live in class, we would spend a lot of time discussing just how horrible a story that is. But what I want you to understand is that as you read that story, I want you to hold, and all the other stories in the book of Joshua, keep this in mind. Some of these stories are prescriptive. Some of what we read in the Bible is prescriptive. That is, it is prescribed to us to do. Some of what we read in Scripture is descriptive. It's simply describing what people did. And a lot of what we read in the book of Joshua is a description of what people did. All right? So let me just finish up here by talking about two quick things. Story of Deborah and Jael, and then the longing for a king among the people of Israel. Now, in the story of Deborah and Jael, let me make mention of this. During the time of Judges, there is no king ruling in Israel. All right? There are different people who rise up and lead the people of Israel. These are the people known as the judges. They judge disputes between people, and then also if they have to go to battle, they lead the people of Israel in battle. There was one judge by the name of Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth. She judged Israel underneath a tree. So the people of Israel would come to her, and they would, if there were disputes, land disagreements, arguments about inheritances, and so forth, she would resolve those for them. Well, at some point, Israel has to go to battle, and Deborah is the leader. And the main military leader is a guy named Barak, from where we get the name Barack Obama, of course. But Barak comes to Deborah and says, Deborah, I'm not willing to go and do this battle unless you come with us. And Deborah tells Barak, she says, Barak, if I go with you, I'm the one who's going to get the glory. And Barak says to her, and I think this is a pretty classy move on Barak. Barak says, Deborah, if you go up and lead, that's fine if you get all the glory. The most important thing is that we win this battle. So Deborah and Barak lead all of Israel in battle, and they succeed. And Deborah receives the glory. And in chapter 5 of the book of Judges, there's an ancient psalm or poem or song called the Song of Deborah. And it's really a really fascinating story. But let me share one last very violent event that occurs in the story of Deborah and Barak, and that regards the person named Jael. Jael was a young woman who was married, who was living in a tent, and she was attached to the people of Israel, even though she herself was not a native Israelite. She was loyal to the Israelites, even though she was not one herself. The leader of the army that was fighting the Israelites is a guy named Sisera. The battle is won, and Sisera is trying to escape from the battle. Cowardly, he runs into this tent where Jael is living, and he asks Jael to hide him there. So Jael says, okay, I'll hide you here, and she gives him some milk to drink to refresh him. And while he lays down to hide underneath the blankets on the bottom of the tent, Jael takes a tent peg in one hand and a hammer or a mallet in the other, and she drives the tent peg through the skull of Sisera and literally pins him to the ground and kills the leader of the invading army. The great thing about this story is not just the graphic nature of it. The important thing for you to keep in mind about this story is that in it, two women, unlikely as that is, two women are the ones who lead Israel to victory militarily. And that's what you read in the Song of Deborah. in chapter 5 of Judges. It talks about Deborah, it talks about Jael, it talks about Sisera. And speaking of Deborah, that's her right there. That's my cat, Deborah. She is named for Deborah in the Bible. Anyway, I think she heard her name over and over again, so she came inside. Last thing I want to tell you about the book of Judges, and it comes back to where I introduced the book of Judges, which is the last verse, when it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." God's preference for the people of Israel was to lead them through judges, was to lead them through people like Deborah and Ehud and Gideon and other people. But the people of Israel longed for a king. And one of their justifications for getting a king in Israel was the violence and the disorganization and the craziness, the horrible craziness that was happening among the people of Israel. So when you get ready to read the next chapter for next week, or the next reading assignments that are coming up, not this week but next week, you're going to read about Samuel, and you're going to read about David, and this entire discussion about a king in Israel is going to come up. I want you to keep in mind that the reason that Israel was ready for a king was because of all of this craziness that was going on. And God allowed Israel, even though it wasn't his primary approach, his first choice, God allowed Israel to assign for themselves a king that would lead them. And that's where we're going to end up discussing. That's what we're going to end up discussing next week. I hope you guys do well in the class. Read, watch the videos, watch this video, and write those summaries this week. And if you have any questions, email, text, or call me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about that. God bless you guys, and be safe. Bye-bye.